The Avengers didn't fall in a blaze of glory. They fell in a courtroom, under fluorescent lights, with cameras rolling and the whole world watching one simple question tear them apart. Who gets to decide when the Avengers act? And once that question got asked out loud, there was no putting the team back together the way it used to be. It started with smoke, broken concrete, and a fight that should have been routine. A group of young heroes was chasing villains through a neighborhood, the kind of loud, messy, super battle Marvel civilians had learned to live around, until one of the bad guys detonated with the force of a small warhead. The blast ripped through houses, scorched the street black, and left a school in ruins. In the ash and sirens, it wasn't just bodies they counted. It was trust. And that was the thing the superhero community didn't know how to replace, which meant the pressure was about to land on the Avengers, whether they caused the disaster or not. Because once ordinary people saw children and teachers die in a battle between costumes, the argument changed overnight. This wasn't about cheering for heroes anymore. Now it was about accountability, names, command structures, government oversight, and whether anyone with powers had the right to decide for the rest of the world. If you've ever thought the Avengers worked best when they were messy and free, because this is the exact moment that freedom started to look dangerous to everyone outside the mask. Tony Stark understood the shift before most of the others did, and that's what made him so dangerous here. He stood in expensive suits instead of armor, sat before microphones, and tried to sell a brutal idea with calm logic: registration. Heroes would reveal who they were, train officially, answer to the government, and operate inside a system instead of above it. On paper, it sounded responsible. In practice, it meant the end of the Avengers as a family making its own calls, and Tony knew somebody on the other side was going to draw a line in the sand. That somebody was Steve Rogers, and the split wasn't loud at first. It was colder than that. Steve saw registration as the first clean step toward turning living people into state property, and once he caught the scent of that, no speech was going to calm him down. Picture it for a second. A Shield helicarrier humming in the air, metal walls, agents with weapons ready, Maria Hill telling Captain America he's expected to bring in heroes who refuse to register, and Steve just staring at her like the room has gone insane before he moves. The moment he chose to fight his way out instead of obeying, the argument stopped being political and became personal, and suddenly the Avengers weren't debating policy anymore. They were choosing sides. That was the real beginning of the end, because the split cut straight through friendships people thought were unbreakable. Tony wasn't twirling his mustache, and Steve wasn't being naive. That's what hurts about this story. Both men believed they were protecting people, but the closer they got to their version of safety, the more damage they did to everyone standing between them, and the team roster started to feel less like a lineup and more like a custody battle. Heroes who'd fought aliens and robots together were now meeting in secret, whispering in safe houses, checking doors before speaking. On one side, you had people who thought some freedom had to be sacrificed before more civilians died. On the other, heroes who saw forced registration as a betrayal of everything they stood for. And because this is Marvel, it didn't stay theoretical for long. Friends started hunting friends. Secret identities became weapons. The public watched the whole thing like a slow-motion car crash, and every time one hero arrested another, the Avengers brand cracked a little wider. If that kind of betrayal is exactly why superhero history gets so brutal, subscribe, because the ugliest part hadn't even happened yet. What made it worse was that Tony and Reed Richards didn't just support the system. They started building one. That meant databases, prisons, strike teams, legal pressure, and a machine strong enough to force compliance from people who used to save the world because it was right, not because they'd signed paperwork. The sharpest symbol of that shift was Prison 42, a holding facility in the negative zone, a place so far from Earth it felt less like justice and more like exile. Once heroes were being locked in an off-world cage by other heroes, the question wasn't whether the Avengers could survive this. It was how much of themselves they were willing to burn to win. Steve's side answered by going underground. They weren't just resisting a law now. They were breaking their former teammates out of custody, dodging surveillance, moving through the shadows like criminals in their own country. That reversal hit hard, because Captain America had gone from America's cleanest symbol to the face of outlaw resistance, and every punch thrown after that carried a little more heartbreak than anger. The costumes were the same. The shields and armor still flashed under city lights, but the meaning had changed, and the fight was racing toward the one thing nobody really believed they'd allow, an all-out war between Avengers. And that's the part people remember, the giant showdown, the iconic poses, heroes crashing into each other in a mess of loyalty and regret. But the day the Avengers truly disbanded forever didn't happen when the first punch landed. It happened earlier, in the quieter choices, when trust got replaced with files, when principle hardened into paranoia, and when both sides decided the other one had to be stopped instead of understood. By the time the war went public, the team was already dead on the inside, and the only question left was what would be standing in the rubble when their symbols stopped meaning the same thing. And then the law got a face. Not a speech, not a headline, not even a courtroom. A teenage boy in a red and blue mask stood under studio lights and peeled that mask off with shaking fingers. Peter Parker looked straight into the cameras and said his name out loud, and in that 1 second the whole country saw what registration really meant. It wasn't just accountability. It was exposure, leverage, and a target painted on everyone you loved, which is why so many readers still tense up at that moment. And if that hit you too, you'll want to stick with this, because the damage from that unmasking spread way past Peter himself. Tony Stark had sold the idea like structure, like safety, like a grown-up answer to chaos. But standing beside a kid who just traded his last piece of privacy for a political message, he didn't look like a genius saving the future. He looked like a man already too deep to back out. The cameras caught applause, but what mattered was the thing they couldn't film. Every hero watching from somewhere else, realizing that if Spider-Man could be brought forward like that, then nobody was untouchable anymore, and that fear pushed the fence-sitters toward a choice they couldn't take back. Steve Rogers saw the same footage and read it completely differently. To Tony, it proved the plan could work because a beloved hero had endorsed it. To Steve, it proved the machine had started eating its own. You can almost picture him holding that thought in grim silence, jaw set, shield near the wall, understanding that the argument had just stopped being theoretical because now refusing to register didn't mean criticism or bad press. It meant becoming prey. And once Captain America accepted that, he stopped trying to win the debate and started trying to get people out. That shift changed everything. The anti-registration side wasn't a protest anymore. It became an underground railroad for superheroes. Safe houses, coded messages, midnight movement through back alleys and abandoned tunnels. Heroes who used to fly over city skylines now slipping through shadows like fugitives. It's one of the bleakest reversals in Marvel history, honestly, seeing icons treated like contraband. So if you're into these moments where the line between hero and outlaw gets completely twisted, this is a good time to subscribe, because the next turn is where the war stops feeling political and starts feeling personal. And personal is exactly what Tony made it. He didn't just build arguments. He built infrastructure, prisons, tracking systems, response teams, files upon files on friends he used to joke with in Avengers meetings. The ugliest symbol of it all was Negative Zone Prison, a cold, sealed place built to hold unregistered heroes off-world, hidden from public view like a problem nobody wanted to say out loud. Once that existed, Steve's side wasn't imagining government overreach anymore. They had proof in steel walls and force fields, and the moment that secret got out, even people who hated Steve had to ask the same question. Since when did the Avengers start disappearing their own? Then came the hunt that made the split feel unforgivable. Frank Castle showed up around Steve's resistance, and even among anti-registration fighters, that was gasoline near an open flame. Castle wasn't a teammate. He was a walking warning sign, a man Steve would never truly trust, and that tension only got worse when two villains came in claiming they wanted to defect to Cap's side. Before anybody could breathe, Castle pulled guns and dropped them where they stood. No trial, no hesitation, just blood on the floor and smoke in the air while the room froze around him, and Steve's reaction told you everything about who he still was. He beat Frank down with his bare hands. Not because the dead men were innocent. Not because the war had made Steve soft. He did it because this was the line, the one line he refused to let the resistance cross, even while his own side was cornered and losing. That scene matters so much because it proves Captain America wasn't trying to build a winner. He was trying to save a moral center that was slipping away from everybody, and if that kind of impossible stand is why Cap works for you, drop a like on this one, because Tony was about to cross a line of his own and he'd never be able to walk it back. Because if Steve's side had shadows, Tony's side had monsters wearing official badges. To catch heroes, Iron Man's camp started leaning on villains. Dangerous people folded into sanctioned teams because they were useful, controllable, deniable, at least on paper. But paper doesn't fight. Paper doesn't panic. Paper doesn't tell you what happens when unstable killers get told they're the good guys now, and the answer arrived in one of the cruelest blows of the whole event. Thor came back. Except it wasn't Thor. It was a cloned version, a huge, hard-eyed copy built from stolen DNA and warped science, dropped onto a battlefield like a god-shaped weapon. For one awful moment, the pro-registration side got what looked like divine backup, and then the thing opened fire with a bolt of lightning so savage it tore straight through Bill Foster. Goliath hit the ground dead, giant body collapsing in front of heroes from both sides, and all the noise of the fight seemed to die with him. In an instant, registration stopped being about law, security, or responsibility. A man was gone, killed by something Tony's side had unleashed, and now nobody in this war could pretend they still recognized the team they used to belong to. Nobody had a speech ready for that. 1 second, Bill Foster was towering over the battlefield, trying to hold the line long enough for people to breathe, and the next there was a smoking hole through his chest and a giant body slamming into the dirt hard enough to shake everybody standing nearby. Even the heroes who'd been screaming at each other a heartbeat earlier just froze, because this wasn't a bad call anymore. This was death, sudden and ugly, and it had Tony Stark's fingerprints all over it, which meant the fight didn't calm down after Goliath fell. It broke open. You can almost picture the exact second trust finally snapped. Captain America looked across that wrecked street and realized the pro-registration side hadn't just built prison cells and legal arguments. They'd built weapons they couldn't fully control, and now one of their own friends was dead because of it. If Bill Foster deserved better than becoming collateral in a war between heroes, hit like on this video, because that death changed the moral center of everything, and Cap's next move came from that wound. He stopped fighting to win the argument and started fighting to get his people out alive. Around him, the secret Avengers weren't some bold underground resistance anymore. They were exhausted, bloodied, and suddenly staring at the future, waiting for them if they lost. Because waiting in the negative zone was Prison 42, a cold steel nightmare floating in another dimension, where unregistered heroes were being locked away like superhuman contraband, and once that truth got dragged into the light, the war got even uglier. That prison was the part Tony and Reed kept dressing up as necessity, but in the harsh white corridors of 42, necessity looked a lot like fear wearing a badge. Tiny cells, no sunlight, no jury. Just a silent facility built in a place so hostile no ordinary person could even survive there, which told everyone exactly what the architects thought of their former teammates. And the worst part was that some of the guards inside weren't soldiers or police at all. They were fellow heroes, standing watch over people they used to call friends, which left Spider-Man staring at a line he could no longer unsee. Peter Parker had already been fraying before Goliath died, but this is where the mask really slipped. He'd trusted Tony more than almost anyone, unmasked for the world because he believed registration might actually protect people, and now he'd seen the clone Thor kill a man and learned what Prison 42 really was. So when Tony tried to keep him in line, Peter didn't argue like a kid looking for permission. He walked away like somebody realizing the adult in the room had become the danger. And if you've ever watched a believer turn the moment the truth gets too big to ignore, subscribe, because Spider-Man's escape made Tony's side look a lot less united than they wanted anyone to know. And Tony did try to stop him. Not with a calm conversation, either. He sent forces after Peter, and what followed was less a debate than a brutal message. You don't get to leave once you've helped build the machine. Peter got hunted, beaten, and nearly finished off in a grim apartment fight that left him coughing blood and barely conscious. A hero in a half-torn costume, realizing neutrality was no longer available. He only survived because the people Tony's camp wanted buried kept choosing to save each other, and that one rescue pushed the war towards something even more dangerous, because now the anti-registration side had proof that surrender didn't mean safety. From there, both camps hardened. Tony's coalition tightened discipline, leaned harder on surveillance, and kept selling the public on control, while Cap's side became more desperate, more mobile, more convinced that the system was already too corrupted to trust. This wasn't just Iron Man versus Captain America anymore. It was friend groups split in half, marriages strained, old loyalties dragged into courtrooms and alleys and prison transfers, and every fresh arrest made compromise feel weaker. The scary part wasn't that either side thought they were evil. It was that both still thought they were saving the world, which is exactly how people justify crossing the last line. Then the war swerved somewhere nobody could cleanly defend. Villains started being used as assets. The Thunderbolts, criminals with shock collars and government approval, were folded into enforcement because the clean options were already gone. On paper, it solved a manpower problem. In practice, it meant registered heroes were now standing shoulder to shoulder with killers and predators, all in the name of public order, and once that happened, the message to Cap's side was crystal clear. The law was no longer asking for obedience. It was demanding submission. That choice poisoned everything it touched. When your side claims moral authority but keeps outsourcing its dirtiest work to monsters, every speech about safety starts sounding hollow. Heroes who'd tried to stay moderate saw that lineup and felt their stomach drop, because now the registration camp wasn't just overreaching. It was compromised from the inside. And if the people enforcing peace were becoming indistinguishable from the threats they used to fight, then the final clash wasn't going to be avoided by one more negotiation. It was going to explode in the middle of New York, with both sides bringing everything they had, and no guarantee the Avengers would still exist when the smoke cleared. By the time both sides finally moved, it didn't look like a superhero showdown anymore. It looked like a city bracing for a riot with capes in the middle of it. Streets were blocked, civilians were glued to live news feeds, and above it all, Tony's side came in organized and armored, while Cap's side came in like people who'd already accepted they might not be walking back out. And that difference made the first impact feel less like a battle and more like a breakup happening in public. The spark came fast. A prison convoy, a rescue attempt, a few seconds of shouting, and then somebody threw the first hit hard enough that talking was over. Shields slammed into armor, energy blasts lit up the pavement, and suddenly heroes who'd once traded jokes on the same jet were driving each other through concrete. If this is the moment in Marvel history that still messes with you, hit like and stay with me, because the ugliest part wasn't that they fought. It was how quickly each side started fighting like they already knew the other one's habits. That's what made the clash so brutal. Tony had built a machine around registration, with strategy, surveillance, and backup stacked 3 layers deep. But Steve had something harder to counter: trust that had once lived inside the team itself. He knew who would faint, who would hesitate, who'd protect civilians even at the cost of the objective, and for a few breathless minutes that let the anti-registration side punch way above its weight until the hidden advantage Tony had been saving finally dropped into view. Thor stepped onto the field, and for one heartbeat people thought the war was over. Not because anyone wanted that, but because the real Thor was one of the few beings alive who could stop this without picking a side. Then the lightning didn't feel right. The face was too still, the movements too clean, and when this thing swung its hammer, it did it like a weapon system, not a friend returning home, which is when the room temperature horror set in. This wasn't Thor. It was the clone. And if you've ever hated this twist as much as fans still do, subscribe, because what that machine did next is the moment this conflict stopped being defensible. Bill Foster barely had time to react. 1 second he was giant-sized, trying to contain the chaos and keep people from getting flattened under the crossfire, and the next that fake Thor drove a blast straight through him with enough force to tear the air apart. There was a flash, a smoking hole, bodies freezing in place, and then the awful delay before everyone understood that a man they knew, a hero they'd fought beside, had just been killed by one side's secret weapon in the middle of an argument about public safety. That instant changed the emotional math of the war, because after that nobody could pretend this was just policy with costumes, and the surviving heroes had to decide whether they were still fighting for principle or just trapped inside revenge. Cap's side broke first, not morally, but physically. The death of Goliath sent a shock through the whole field, and once the clone kept pressing, the anti-registration team did what teams do when a fight turns into a massacre. They ran. Not out of cowardice, but because staying there meant giving Tony's camp more bodies to explain later. Cloaks snapped, portals opened, wounded heroes were dragged off the street by the arms, and Steve was left staring at the kind of retreat that tells you something simple and crushing. You can be right and still be losing, which pushed the conflict into a far darker place. Because now Tony had won the moment, but not the war. He was left with a dead Avenger on the pavement, a cyborg Thor experiment nobody could morally justify, and a registration program that suddenly looked a lot less like order and a lot more like a machine willing to kill dissenters. The pro-registration side tried to contain the fallout, but that image would not go away. Bill Foster's body, the scorched street, the stunned faces of heroes who realized they were standing beside something monstrous. And once that picture settled into the public mind, the question changed from who was legal to who could still be trusted with power at all. That's when Tony made one of the most revealing decisions of the entire event. He didn't shut the operation down. He tightened it. He kept building the system, kept selling the argument that one disaster in the field didn't erase the need for accountability, and on paper that sounds cold, but inside Tony's head it was worse than cold. It was desperate. He'd convinced himself that if he stopped now, then Goliath had died for nothing, and that kind of thinking can turn even a good man into the custodian of something rotten, which is exactly why Steve's next move hit so hard. Captain America went underground for real. Not as a symbol on a poster, but as a hunted man moving through back rooms, safe houses, and whispered networks of allies who still believed the line had been crossed. The Secret Avengers weren't trying to win a headline anymore. They were trying to survive long enough to expose what registration had become, and every new recruit, every hidden corridor, every emergency call from frightened heroes widened the split that no press conference could repair. If you're still feeling that slow collapse of the team right here, drop a like, because the Avengers weren't marching toward reunion anymore. They were heading toward the moment where one last battle would force Steve to choose between winning the fight and destroying the very people he was trying to save. By the time both sides crashed into the middle of New York, this wasn't a debate anymore. It was lightning tearing across wet streets, broken glass skittering under boots, civilians flattened against storefront windows, while heroes they'd trusted started swinging at each other in broad daylight. Steve had built his whole resistance around one stubborn idea, that you don't protect freedom by putting a chain around it, but now every punch thrown in its name was landing on someone who used to answer to the same emergency signal. And for a second, it looked like the anti-registration side might actually pull it off. Their prison break had worked, reinforcements were coming in hot, and the pro-registration line started bending under the pressure as energy blasts lit up the avenue in white and blue flashes. You could feel the momentum tipping, the kind of battlefield swing where one more push changes history. But that's exactly when Tony's side unveiled the thing that made the whole war feel colder than any supervillain attack ever had. Because the backup that hit Steve's team wasn't just more heroes. It was a squad of villains, drafted into service, sent into the street like legal weapons because the law had stopped caring who wore the badge as long as they signed the paper. The image was horrifying in how simple it was. Registered heroes, shoulder to shoulder with criminals they would have arrested last month, charging at Captain America under government authority. If that detail still makes Civil War feel more disturbing than flashy, hit subscribe, because this is the moment the Avengers stopped being a family feud and started looking like a machine that would use anyone to crush dissent. The street fight turned savage fast after that. Limbs snapped, masks tore, people got dog-piled in the middle of smoking taxi wrecks, and every new arrival made the scene less like a superhero clash and more like a riot with powers. Steve kept pushing anyway, because from his point of view, the nightmare unfolding around him was proof he'd been right all along. But then the battle stopped listening to the people who started it, and the crowd did something neither side had really prepared for. Ordinary civilians rushed in. Not to cheer, not to pick a side, to make it stop. A firefighter grabbed at Steve's arm. A paramedic shouted in his face. Bystanders with ash on their coats and fear in their eyes threw themselves between living weapons because they were watching their city get torn apart by the people who claimed to be saving it. And in one brutal instant, Steve saw what the war looked like from ground level. Not principle, not liberty, not necessary resistance. Just Captain America pinning a man in the street while terrified civilians begged heroes to stop fighting over them. That realization hit harder than any punch in the battle. Steve looked around at the shattered pavement, the the sirens, the smoke hanging in the air, and understood the part he hadn't let himself see. Even if he won right here, he'd lose the reason he started. He wasn't defending the public anymore if the public had to physically climb onto his back to stop the damage. If you've ever respected a hero more for the fight he refused to finish than the ones he won, drop a like. Because Steve's next move didn't save his side. It ended the Avengers as they'd existed for generations. He stopped. Not because Tony beat him. Not because registration had been proven right. Steve Rogers simply made the most painful call of the whole war and surrendered. Around him, his own allies stared in disbelief. Some were still mid-swing when they realized Captain America was no longer resisting, just standing there in a torn uniform, lowering his guard while the battle noise kept echoing off the buildings for one strange, stunned second before everyone understood what he was doing. And once Steve gave up, the war collapsed all at once. Heroes who'd crossed lines they could never uncross were suddenly left holding the consequences in plain view. Tony technically got what he'd wanted. Registration stood, the rebellion was broken, and the government could call it order restored. But victory looked ugly up close. The streets were wrecked, trust was gone, and the man who'd just surrendered wasn't some fringe rebel anymore. He was Captain America, in handcuffs, walking through a city that didn't look relieved so much as heartbroken. That image mattered more than any policy speech. Steve being led away by federal agents, shoulders still squared, blood on the costume, cameras flashing from every angle, made the split inside the superhero world permanent. Some heroes saw a dangerous holdout finally brought in. Others saw the living symbol of the Avengers being marched off like a criminal for refusing to trade conscience for compliance. Either way, nobody could pretend the team would just patch this up later over a meeting table, and if you want the exact moment that break became irreversible, subscribe now, because Tony was about to inherit everything he thought he wanted, and it would start poisoning him almost immediately. With Steve gone, the old Avengers weren't merely defeated, they were structurally dead. The mansion, the trust, the shared mission, even the idea that these people could disagree and still remain one team had been smashed in public where the whole world could see it. Tony Stark would step into the vacuum with more authority than ever before, but power gained from the ruins of your own family comes with a bill, and the next shock would prove the war hadn't really ended at all. Tony didn't get a victory lap. He got a clipboard, a government leash, and a team that barely looked like the Avengers anymore. Where Steve had inspired loyalty by walking into the fire first, Tony now had to manage schedules, clearances, registries, and a public that wanted superheroes only if they came with signatures and surveillance, and that difference was about to split the room all over again. Because the first ugly truth of the post-war Avengers was simple. Registration hadn't created trust. It had only made disobedience easier to define. You could feel it in the way people stood around the meeting table, not shoulder to shoulder like a family, but spaced apart like coworkers waiting for somebody else to say the wrong thing. And if that fracture still gets under your skin, hit like on the video, because this is the part where the team stopped breaking in theory and started breaking in practice. Tony tried to stabilize the whole thing by building from the top down. Official rosters, official briefings, official approval. On paper, that sounds responsible, but the Avengers had never really worked like a clean military chain. They worked because giant egos somehow chose each other in the worst moments, and once that choice got replaced by policy, every mission carried a quiet question in the background. Are we here because we trust each other, or because somebody signed off on us? That question got teeth when the people who used to be the heart of the team were suddenly outside the room. Luke Cage, Spider-Man, Wolverine, and the others who'd stood with Steve weren't just absent. They were reminders that the Avengers name no longer meant one center. Somewhere else, in apartments, safe houses, alley meetings, and whispered phone calls, a different kind of team was forming from people who still believed the system itself had failed. And the second there are two Avengers in spirit, there are really none. Then Marvel twisted the knife. The public face of security was tightening at the exact moment the world got more dangerous, not less. Villains didn't look at Civil War and think, maybe we should calm down. They saw heroes exhausted, divided, second-guessing every move, and they pushed. That's what made the next blow so brutal. The Avengers didn't fall apart in peacetime reflection. They were forced to watch the world keep burning while their own house was still full of smoke, which made Tony's new authority feel less like control and more like a clock ticking down. And then the initiative era fully kicked in, which was supposed to be the answer to all of this. 50 state teams, training programs, a superhero response network mapped across the country like a military grid. It sounded bigger, smarter, safer. But the wider Tony spread the idea of order, the more obvious the cost became. The Avengers had once been rare because they meant something. Now the concept was being standardized, packaged, franchised, and that polished system couldn't hide the hollow center where trust used to live. If you're into the little moments where big empires start looking fragile up close, subscribe, because the next turn proved this shiny rebuild was sitting on rotten beams. The emblem of that rot wasn't some giant speech. It was how quickly Tony started losing moral ground while still holding power. He was in charge, yes, but he was also making compromises that would have horrified the older version of himself, backing prisons, surveillance, and decisions that looked cleaner in reports than they did in human lives. The armor still shined, the commands still came out crisp, but underneath it was a man telling himself the line had to move because reality had changed, and every time leaders say that, somebody ends up paying for it. That bill came due when the people outside Tony's system stopped acting like defeated rebels and started acting like the conscience of the Marvel Universe. The so-called outlaw side didn't vanish after Steve's surrender. It adapted. Some went underground. Some regrouped. Some carried on helping people without permission, which was exactly the problem, because every successful, unsanctioned rescue made the registered machine look less like salvation and more like bureaucracy in a cape. The public had been told there was one lawful way to save the day, but reality kept producing messy proof that the old spirit of the Avengers was still alive somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. And that's when the title of Avengers stopped meaning what it used to. Not all at once, not with a dramatic stamp across a file, but through erosion. Tony had the building, the resources, the recognition. The others had the emotional legitimacy, the sense that heroism couldn't be filed into a database. Those two truths could coexist for a little while, but not forever, and the next shock would force everyone to choose which version of the Avengers they actually believed in. Then came the move that made the split impossible to pretend away. Tony Stark pushed forward with a registered, government-backed version of the team, polished and official, the kind that looked great in a press photo and felt cold the second you stepped inside it. The mansion still had the logo, the files still said Avengers, but now there were background checks, federal chains of command, and the ugly idea that maybe a superhero only counted if Washington approved the paperwork, which put old friends on a direct collision course. You could feel that tension in the little things before it exploded in the big ones. Carol Danvers stood straighter, spoke like someone carrying the weight of the whole country on her shoulders, and honestly, she believed she was keeping people safe. Across from her, Luke Cage and the new Avengers looked at that same system and saw a leash, because once the state tells heroes who they're allowed to save and who they're allowed to arrest, the mask starts turning into a badge, and not everyone was willing to wear one. And then Tony made it personal. He brought in a new lineup under the Avengers name, and one of the faces standing there was Spider-Man, unmasked, exposed, trying to believe this sacrifice meant something. If that moment still hits you in the chest, hit like and stick with me, because this is where the team stopped being a family argument and started becoming a public divorce with cameras rolling. The crazy part is, both sides still thought they were saving the Avengers. Tony believed order would stop the next disaster before it started. Steve Rogers saw innocent people being hunted for refusing registration, watched prison cells fill with former allies, and realized the name Avengers was now being used to chase heroes through alleys and apartment buildings, which meant the symbol itself had become a weapon. That's why the line finally snapped during Civil War. Not in one neat duel, but through a string of impossible choices where every win tasted rotten. On one side, Iron Man's forces had government sanction, advanced tech, and the legal right to call themselves the real Avengers. On the other, Captain America's underground fighters had trust, conscience, and the increasingly obvious feeling that the law had outrun justice, and when those two visions met head-on, the loser was the team itself. The image that says it all isn't even the biggest fight. It's the way Peter Parker changed sides. After being welcomed into Tony's orbit, after revealing his face to the world, after trusting that the adults in the room knew where this was going, he saw the prison in the negative zone, saw what security was really becoming, and ran. That one decision told everyone watching that this wasn't a debate anymore. It was a moral rupture, and once a young hero risks everything to escape his own side, the whole machine starts to look rotten from the inside. Still, even that wasn't the final break. The real wound came when Captain America surrendered, not because Iron Man beat him clean, but because Steve looked around and saw civilians recoiling from the destruction in their streets. He lowered the shield with blood on his face and exhaustion in his posture, and in that instant the fight stopped being about winning. It became about what the Avengers had turned into in public view, and the answer was devastating. Because after that surrender, there was no clean reset waiting on the other side. Steve was arrested. Trust was gone. Tony got exactly what looked like victory, and found out it felt like inheriting a house after the fire. The registered Avengers existed, sure, but they stood on a foundation of surveillance, grief, and forced loyalty, while the unregistered heroes carried the old spirit without the old home. And if you've ever felt a franchise cross a line and never really come back, that's the moment people are talking about. So subscribe if you want the rest of the collapse, because the next blow made this fracture feel almost gentle. Steve Rogers didn't even make it to trial. Before the country could process what his surrender meant, he was assassinated on courthouse steps, and that murder sent a shockwave through every remaining piece of the superhero community. Suddenly, this wasn't just about policy or ego or who got to use the Avengers name. The moral center of the team was gone. Tony was left holding the symbol in the worst possible way, and the question hanging over everyone now was brutal. If Captain America was dead, what exactly was left to reunite? Steve's blood was barely dry on the courthouse steps before the blame started moving like wildfire. Not just grief, blame. Cameras flashed, agents locked down the street, and in the middle of all that noise, Tony Stark was standing there as the face of the side that had won the argument and somehow lost everything that mattered. If that gut punch still hits you, drop a like right here, because this is the moment the Civil War stopped being politics and became a wound that never really closed. At first, people did what people always do after a tragedy like that. They looked for a single monster to pin it on, and for 1 second it seemed almost simple. Sharon Carter had fired the shot, but her eyes were glassy, her movements wrong, like somebody else was pulling the strings from inside her skull, and that made the whole thing even uglier. Because if Steve Rogers could survive world wars, cosmic invasions, and his own friends turning on him, only to die because his guard was down in front of a courthouse, then nobody in the hero community felt safe anymore, and Tony was about to learn that safety wasn't the same thing as trust. That's what made the next turn so brutal. On paper, Tony now had more authority than almost anyone in the superhero world. The initiative was running, registered teams were being organized state by state, and he had the keys to the machines Steve had died fighting. But every room he walked into had that same chill to it. You can picture it. Polished briefing tables, glowing screens, government seals on the wall, and Tony trying to talk strategy while everybody else was silently wondering if this was the future Captain America died for. If you're into Marvel when it gets painfully messy instead of clean and heroic, subscribe, because Tony finally got the win he thought he wanted, and it landed like a curse. The public split too, and that might have hurt the Avengers' idea even more than any supervillain attack. To some people, Stark was the responsible adult holding the line after chaos. To others, he was the man who helped hunt his own friends, then stood at the center of the system that ended with Steve in the ground. That kind of divide doesn't stay on the news. It creeps into every alliance, every call for help, every mission briefing, because the question stopped being, "Are the Avengers back?" and became, "Back for who?" And the answer was getting uglier by the day. Then Marvel twisted the knife. Tony didn't get time to sit in grief because almost immediately the role of Captain America became its own battlefield. Steve had left behind a shield, an empty symbol, and a country desperate to pretend symbols could heal what people had broken. But Bucky Barnes was still out there carrying years of blood on his hands, and Sam Wilson was still mourning a friend instead of chasing a costume, so the mantle didn't unite anyone. It exposed the fracture all over again. Every conversation about who should carry Steve's legacy also asked a meaner question underneath it. Did the Avengers deserve to have a legacy at all? And while that argument was boiling, the thing holding the team together got even thinner, because the Avengers weren't really one team anymore. There were registered heroes tied to the system, underground heroes still operating in the shadows, and former teammates who could barely look at each other without remembering prison breaks, betrayals, and that final fight where Steve chose surrender over one more punch. You could almost feel the silence when old allies crossed paths now. No battle cry, no group shot, just stiff shoulders, narrowed eyes, and too much history packed into one hallway. If you've ever thought the hardest part of Civil War wasn't the fight but the aftermath, hit like, because this is where Marvel shows the real damage doesn't happen during the punch-it, happens after everyone goes home. That would have been enough to break most teams, but this was Marvel, so the pressure kept rising. The people who had been hiding in the shadows during Civil War saw exactly what the heroes had become: divided, exhausted, easy to manipulate. The Skrull Queen Varanki had spent years preparing for this, and Steve's death gave her the perfect opening. While Tony was trying to manage registration, grief, public anger, and the rotting trust inside the superhero community, enemy agents were already in place, wearing friendly faces, learning routines, waiting for the right second to tear the whole thing open from the inside. And that's the cruel part. The day the Avengers disbanded forever wasn't really one clean vote, one speech, or one dramatic door slam. It was this stretch right here, where the old dreams stopped feeling recoverable. The mansion, the title, the government-approved version, the outlaw version, the memory of Steve's team from better years, they were all still sitting there in pieces, but nobody could honestly pretend they formed one heartbeat anymore. The Avengers as an idea had survived aliens and robots and gods, yet what finally broke them was simpler and sadder. They stopped believing in the same future. Tony could still build armor. Heroes could still answer emergencies. New rosters could still be announced. But the original promise that these impossible people could stand shoulder to shoulder when it mattered most had cracked straight down the middle, and the world was about to find out how expensive that crack really was. Because the invasion coming next didn't just test whether the Avengers could win. It tested whether a team that no longer trusted its own faces could even tell who was standing beside them. And that question got ugly fast, because the attack that hit next didn't come with one army. It came with confusion. In the middle of the chaos, heroes started spotting teammates in places they shouldn't have been, hearing orders that didn't sound quite right, watching familiar faces move with just enough wrongness to make your stomach tighten before your brain could explain it. That was the real damage from the breakup. The Avengers weren't walking into battle as one body anymore, and when trust is already hanging by a thread, a shapeshifter doesn't need much to make the whole thing snap. The trap worked because it preyed on old wounds, not new ones. Iron Man saw reasons to suspect Captain America's side. Captain America saw reasons to believe Tony had built another secret plan behind everyone's back. Around them, people who'd once charged aliens shoulder to shoulder were now studying each other's eyes, hands, and timing, trying to figure out whether the person next to them was tired, scared, lying, or not even the real one. If that slow-burn paranoia is exactly why this era of Marvel hits so hard, drop a like, because this is the point where the Avengers stop feeling broken and start feeling haunted. And then came the reveal that made the whole room colder. Elektra, who had been moving through the superhero world like a dangerous ally, was exposed as a Skrull, not a random soldier, a planted replacement. Suddenly, every recent conversation, every uneasy alliance, every decision made under pressure had to be looked at again through a different lens. And the simplest question in the room became the most terrifying one. If she was one of them, who else was? The invasion didn't begin when the ships appeared in the sky. It began the second Earth realized the enemy had already been breathing its air for a very long time. From there, the panic spread wider than any explosion could. Reed Richards had tried to study the problem. Tony Stark had tried to prepare for every angle. The Illuminati, those men who believed they could get in front of disasters by acting in secret, discovered that secrecy had handed the Skrulls exactly what they needed. Prideful people making isolated decisions, each convinced he still had enough control to manage the fallout. You can picture it like a chessboard flipped over in the middle of the game, pieces scattered, players shouting over one another, and nobody fully sure which moves had even been real. If you're into the Marvel stories where the smartest guy in the room still can't stop the collapse, subscribe, because that failure is about to get very personal. What made it worse was that the Skrulls didn't just copy powers or faces. They copied history well enough to weaponize memory. Friends hesitated before throwing punches. Leaders delayed because one wrong call could mean killing an ally, and one slow call could mean losing a city. In another age, the Avengers would have answered that kind of crisis by tightening formation. But this time, the very idea of Avengers Assemble had turned unstable, because assembling only gave the enemy a bigger target to contaminate. Every second they spent asking who was real was a second the invasion used to root itself deeper, and Norman Osborn saw that opening before almost anyone else. While the traditional heroes were stuck in suspicion and triage, Osborn stepped into the frame with the one thing frightened people always reward: a visible answer. He barked orders, pointed guns in the right direction, put himself where cameras could catch the smoke and fire behind him, and suddenly this man, this deeply compromised man, looked decisive while the Avengers looked divided. That image mattered more than it should have, and if that twist still makes your blood boil, hit like, because Marvel was showing something brutally honest here. When heroes fracture in public, someone worse is always waiting to sell order in their place. By the time the dust started to settle, the invasion had exposed more than hidden Skrulls. It exposed how completely the Avengers as an institution had lost control of the story around them. The public didn't see all the impossible choices or the years of pressure that led here. They saw heroes fighting heroes, secret groups making secret calls, replacements hiding in plain sight, and one grinning opportunist positioned right where a savior was supposed to stand. The team hadn't merely broken apart on the inside anymore. Now the world had evidence, and that meant whatever came next wouldn't be about rebuilding trust in a mansion or on a helicarrier. It would be about surviving what people do when they stop believing the old symbols can protect them. And that's the part that makes Disbanded Forever land so hard, because the Avengers weren't erased in one dramatic blast. They were outmaneuvered into becoming a vacuum. Nature hates a vacuum. Politics hates it even more. The second the old center failed, power rushed in wearing a darker smile, and the heroes who were still standing had to face a nightmare bigger than invasion itself. Not just how to defeat the enemy, but how to stop the wrong man from inheriting the world they had just failed to hold together. And that's where the collapse stops being a tragedy and turns into a hostile takeover. The old Avengers are broken, scattered, grieving, and before they can even decide whether the team still exists, Norman Osborn steps into the empty spotlight with a flag behind him and blood still drying under the paint. He doesn't just claim victory. He claims legitimacy, and that's worse. Because a villain you can punch is one problem, but a villain standing at a podium with government backing is a whole different monster. You can almost picture the sick joke of it. Tony Stark is branded the man who let the world fall apart. S-H-I-E-L-D gets stripped away, and Osborn is handed the keys to national security like he earned them. The man with a screaming goblin face buried under his skin puts on a dark suit, smooths his hair back, and smiles for cameras. And if that switch from disaster to political nightmare hits you as hard as it should, hit like and stay with me, because the Avengers didn't just lose a war here. They lost the right to define what a hero even was. That's the part people miss when they hear Disbanded Forever. It wasn't literally forever in the calendar sense. It was forever in the emotional sense, forever in the mythic sense, because the thing called the Avengers had been hollowed out so completely that what came after wore the name like stolen armor. Osborn builds his own version of Earth's mightiest heroes, but it's a costume rack of lies, killers dressed as icons, unstable monsters painted up as protectors, men pretending to be legends they could never understand, and suddenly the public sees an Avengers tower, an Avengers lineup, an Avengers brand, while the real soul of the team is out in the cold asking what exactly is left to save. And that question hurts because the survivors don't get a clean, heroic regroup. They get hiding, suspicion, and the ugly work of staying alive long enough to resist a system that now calls them the threat. Luke Cage, Spider-Man, Wolverine, Spider-Woman, and the others who had carried the outlaw version of the team are pushed into shadows and safe houses, not glorious bases, while Clint Barton's grief curdles into rage sharp enough to cut steel. The masks are still there, the powers are still there, but the trust is gone, and when trust dies inside a team like this, even standing in the same room starts to feel like a risk. What makes it even crueler is that some of this disaster came from wounds they never really treated. Wanda's breakdown, Tony's registration push, Steve's assassination, Skrull paranoia, every shortcut taken in the name of safety or control. None of it vanished when the invasion ended. It all sat there like cracked glass under a rug, and Osborn was the first man ruthless enough to jump exactly where the floor was weakest, which means the end of the Avengers wasn't just caused by one enemy. It was built, piece by piece, by fear, pride, grief, and the constant temptation to force unity instead of earning it. That's why this moment matters so much in Marvel history. The Avengers had survived robot uprisings, alien attacks, gods, monsters, and world-ending madmen. But the thing that truly ended them was something quieter and uglier. They stopped agreeing on who they were for. Were they protectors, soldiers, police, symbols, family, or weapons pointed wherever the state decided? That argument had been smoldering for years, and by the time Osborn arrived with a fake smile and a real gun, all he had to do was breathe on it. And the cruel brilliance of Disbanded Forever is that it makes you feel the loss before you measure the timeline. Teams can reform, brands can come back, costumes can be redesigned, and headquarters rebuilt. But there are certain versions of people, certain fragile combinations of trust and purpose that only exist once, and when those break, you don't really rebuild them. That's the day they disbanded forever. Not when the mansion exploded, not when one member quit, not even when the last fight ended, but when the name Avengers could be hijacked while the real heroes stood outside the gates, battered and unwanted, staring at a world they no longer recognized. That was the wound that never fully healed, and that's why this story still echoes, because every version of the Avengers that came later had to answer the same brutal question left behind in that silence. If anyone can wear the symbol, who's worthy of it?